Welcome to the Boomer Briefing Podcast, where we help you solve a critical business issue in 20 minutes or less. I'm your host, Jon Hubbard, shareholder and consultant here at Boomer Consulting. And with me today are Heather and Emilie. Heather and Emilie, thank you for being on this episode of the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Now, Heather, you are our marketing manager. Emilie, you are our marketing coordinator. Both of you play an essential role in the life of our podcasts. And I think all three of us can say we have learned a ton over the last couple of years about podcasting, and we probably knew very little. I think that's safe to say when we started this process, but I think we've learned a lot, and our willingness to share that with our listeners, we think can be beneficial to them. So I'm going to throw a few questions at you and we can see what value we get out of this conversation. So Heather, I'll start with you. Why should firms launch a podcast?
Oh gosh, there's so many reasons, I think. But one of the biggest ones is podcasts really do build trust, credibility, and brand recognition. So just getting your name out there, letting people learn from you and listen about your brand is just a really great opportunity to get your name out there to potential clients. Yeah, I think that's just a huge part of why they're so great.
Emilie, how about from your perspective, any kind of big reasons why you think firms out there should really consider launching a podcast?
Yeah, I agree with everything Heather said. I think it's a really good way to get your name out there. I think something that came to mind for me is that it's content that you can create and constantly be pushing out on your social media and website, depending on when you decide to launch episodes, whether that's weekly or monthly, however it may be. It's just another way to push out content to your followers.
Yes, and I do know pretty much every firm struggles with creating new content or having enough content out there that they can put on social media. So a podcast is a really great way to make that happen. If I could throw in an answer too here, I thought about this as I started to ask each of you. I think one of the benefits too of launching a podcast, at least from my perspective, is it actually gives me practice in articulating the type of information I want to articulate, right? If that makes sense. And so when you have to put into words your recommendations for clients or your thought leadership around a certain topic, it really just helps you become more polished. And so if you, as a listener out there, think you could benefit in that way as well, that's just another reason to launch a podcast. So, all right, launching a podcast and maintaining that podcast can be intimidating for a lot of individuals. So what are some tips? Emilie, maybe I'll start with you and then Heather, we'll go to you. What are some tips you would give firms in this area?
Well, Jon, I have quite a few tips. The podcast is kind of something that I work on really every week. So I'm constantly dealing with that or in a platform or technology that it deals with. But I think the biggest thing for me is that I block 2 to 3 hours of time on my calendar monthly to really dig in and work on the podcast. I don't do anything super sporadically, just so I have focus time and I'm not getting distracted by other tasks. So that's my big one, is just block 2 to 3 hours, bulk plan those episodes, schedule them on calendars, think about the topics that you want to release, things like that in that 2 to 3 hour time period. I think something that we at Boomer do is we picked Tuesday as our launch day. So every Tuesday, a new podcast is released and we have stuck with that. So pick that day and stick to it so that your followers and your listeners know when to expect a new podcast. And then my other tip that I would probably give is when you're scheduling out those episodes to be recorded, give yourself some extra time between release dates in case that recording needs to be moved around. So you're not scrambling at the last minute to get an episode recorded and released.
Thanks, Emilie. Heather, how about you?
I think the biggest one, and I actually learned this from Emilie coming on board and really taking over the podcast, is I think it's imperative to have a good process in place. As Emilie said, you're really managing a lot of different technologies, a lot of recordings. For our podcast, Jon is our host, and then we have other consultants come in. Sometimes we look outside of internal people to have on the podcast. That's a lot to juggle. So with having that process in place, it makes sure that you follow along so that you don't forget anything that needs to be done to properly publish your podcast. So it's something that, is an organic process. We have to change it sometimes. We like to add new things to it, add different avenues of social media or different ways to get the content out there, whether it's, trying to promote it by a video or try to promote it by doing graphics. So there's a lot of different things that we've tried. And as we come up with those new ideas or, kind of change things, we just update that process, and it helps us keep on track so that we don't lose ourselves and all of the things in the podcast world.
Yeah, I think we've learned that being ahead of the 8 ball with the process is really crucial, because real quickly you can feel like you're behind and kind of left scrambling. And you mentioned the rescheduling of the recordings. I know that happens a lot. And so having kind of one person to really own it and to manage that schedule is really helpful. And I think having a consistent host too is really helpful. I know we're going to be approaching our 100th episode, and I think one reason we've been able to achieve that number is having a consistent host, and I'm happy to be the lucky one to be the host. But I think if we were switching the host every week or switching it every month, that might create more complexity in the process. I mean, there might be some advantages to that too, but how can you create a standardized approach to recording a podcast that you can repeat weekly or monthly, whatever your release schedule is? So that consistency is a huge thing. That's great. Speak a little bit about if firms were to actually do this. Okay, so maybe they've been talking about it for a while. Some of our listeners will actually go ahead and get in motion and launch their podcast, help them see into the future a little bit, and share with them some of the results they should be anticipating from actually launching a podcast. Emilie, would you like to answer first?
Yeah, I think kind of like we said at the beginning, just by launching the podcast, like Heather mentioned, it builds trust. It gets your name out there. It's fairly easy content to produce and create. I know we don't keep our episodes very long. They're less than 20 minutes. That's a ride to work for some people. So things like that, becoming a known name to your clients. I think for something personally on my end, if they were to take some of these tips and recommendations, something I noticed is that I have more capacity. I block out 2 to 3 hours of time a month to do it. But on Tuesday mornings, I don't have to worry about the podcast because I've done the pre-work. Everything's pre-scheduled. Social media is ready to go. So it ultimately does open up capacity because Tuesday mornings are not taken over by the podcast anymore. So those are a couple of things that, those are some of my recommendations on if people were to follow these tips.
Heather?
Oh, and this is actually the perfect question for it, because what I think people should anticipate is that listeners are going to take action. I was reading in an entrepreneur article that like 76% of listeners of podcasts take action after listening to podcasts. So that's what I really think. If you decide to go ahead and start a podcast, and you start producing episodes that you can really expect your potential clients or current clients to, take your recommendations and listen to things and visit your website and visit your social media. You're going to really see an uptick in engagement with your company if you decide to go ahead and publish a podcast. There's a lot of different things that you could talk about during those episodes that can really either, whether it's pushing your services or even just getting informational things out to your clients. It's a great vehicle for you to really help people.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, one, when you start to hear people say they listen to it, it's kind of surprising, which is funny to even say because, of course, you record it, so people do listen to it. Well, when people start to reference your episodes, reference things you've said that maybe, after 100 episodes, you don't remember what you've said in every single episode. But I think that's really interesting. One of the other kind of benefits, maybe we can call it results to expect as well, that I think is sometimes overlooked with podcasts, is having a podcast is actually a really great way to talk to the people that you want to talk to by inviting them on the podcast, right? So if there's someone you're wanting to have a conversation with, podcasts can actually provide a really relevant context to have that conversation. Invite them on. You can dive into a specific topic or get their expertise. Getting them talking about things that they're comfortable with can be a great way to build relationships as well, and that's always fun. So on this podcast, we always try and take a look outside of the accounting profession and say, hey, is there any one or two bullet points of information that we think are relevant to discuss on this podcast about this topic, in this case, podcast, that's relevant outside the profession, but also relevant inside the profession? So Emilie, I'll start with you. As you think about podcasts outside the profession, what are you seeing out there that maybe is important for our firms to know?
I think something that came to mind immediately for me, especially if firms are thinking about launching a podcast, is just to start. I know it can probably be a little scary, but start there. Think of a topic that your clients may want to listen to. Find someone that's willing to host and just get started and see what happens. I think you can build from there.
Oh, I don't really see any reason why any of this wouldn't be relevant for anybody that's trying to get their content out there. Podcasts are all over. And I think if you look at it in the fact that, so many of us have content coming out, whether it's articles, blogs, white papers, social media, press releases, things like that. Depending on the length of your podcast, you're engaging with a client or a potential client for 15, 20, 30 minutes. That's a huge opportunity for you to really be able to reach out and connect with people. So, regardless of whether you're in the accounting profession or any other profession, find that topic, find out what your potential clients or current clients are looking for, and really harness that and figure out how you can build it into your brand's content strategy, and really, create that strategy around it. And I think it'll be successful.
Yeah. As I look at all the podcasts out there, now there are a lot of podcasts within our profession now, but outside of our profession, you kind of look at those and you think, oh, I wonder who gave them permission to launch that podcast. And guess what? No one did. They took permission to go ahead and launch that podcast. And so I love both of your advice about just getting out there and doing it, and start it, and you'll learn as you go. And that's the quickest way to really find your rhythm with it, is going ahead and starting and being committed to it. So one of the last things I want to ask you, and we touched on it a little bit, but for our listeners that have maybe been thinking about, you know what, I've been thinking about podcasts for the last year or two, if we should do that or not. I want to hear from both of you what your recommendations are for next steps. What's kind of the first thing they should do, or the first couple things they should do to get started? Emilie, I will start with you, and then we'll go to you, Heather.
I think the first thing that someone should do if they've been thinking about this is sit down and brainstorm. If you don't have a host in mind yet or haven't picked anyone yet, make sure you get that done, because you are going to need someone to host the podcast. I think the next thing that someone should do is bulk plan some episodes, whether that's 5 or 10, whatever is feasible for them. Start writing down topics that you think listeners would want to listen to, and then find guests to come on and record those episodes, whether it's internal or external. Just get stuff like that down on paper, and then send a calendar invite and get that first podcast recorded.
Awesome. Heather?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Emilie says. The biggest, I think, hindrance sometimes of starting a podcast is ourselves. We're just scared to get out there and actually do it. And I think one other thing that can really help is do some research, go out, research different podcasts, listen to different podcasts, find out what's out there, find your topic and your niche that you're wanting to work in. I think that'll really help give you ideas of what type of topics that you're wanting to cover on your podcast, and kind of help boost those ideas and, make it easier to get you started.
Awesome. Excellent advice. Now, I do know our listeners, as we kind of round out this episode, I do know our listeners sometimes want to reach out and have conversations with you. I think it's safe to say both of you are active on social media, on LinkedIn, on Twitter as well. People can also go to our website, boomer.com, find your contact information, and go ahead and reach out to you for questions. For those listeners that are interested in starting a podcast, I would also be happy to chat with you if you just want to have a conversation about any additional lessons learned or any additional tips. I know Emilie and Heather would be willing to speak with you as well to help you go ahead and get that launched. But that is bringing us to the conclusion of this episode of the Boomer Briefing Podcast. So Heather and Emilie, thanks again for being on this episode. And for our listeners, we go ahead and release new episodes every Tuesday morning, as Emilie mentioned, I believe. We've done pretty good about not missing a Tuesday morning so far. I don't want to jinx us or anything, but that's when we go ahead and release our new episodes, and we rotate topics every week. So this week was on, growth, marketing, kind of getting content out there. Next week, it might be on leadership or process or technology or talent, things of those sort. But the one common theme among all these episodes is that the topics we discuss are critical to your firm's growth and success. So as always, thank you for listening, and please subscribe to the podcast.